The leaders of China, Russia and North Korea staged a show of solidarity in Beijing this week amid a massive military parade to mark the end of World War II. We have more on Press Perspective today. Welcome to Press Perspective for this Thursday, September 4th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. The open display of dedication to their diplomatic ties by North Korea's Kim Jong-un, his Chinese host Xi Jinping and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin at Beijing's Victory Day parade has been making headlines. For more on this, I have Fabian Kretschmer with German news agency DPA here in the studio. Fabian, welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I also have Andrew Salmon with the Washington Times. Andrew, it's been a while. Great to have you on.
Sunny, hi. Good to see you.
Right, we will start here in the studio. Fabian, let's begin with a short speech shared by Chinese President Xi Jinping at the start of Wednesday's Victory Day parade in Beijing, and of course its significance.
Yeah, I think it was quite significant. So Xi Jinping said that the world now faces again the choice between peace or war, between dialogue or confrontation. And I think what the Chinese leader is trying to do, he tries to position the People's Republic of China as a new alternative world order and basically an anti-Western world order to maybe not replace, but challenge the US. And you can say it's pretty rich because, you know, Xi Jinping, when he was going up the Tiananmen Gate in where the military parade was ongoing, I mean, he had Putin on the right side, Kim Jong-un from North Korea on the left side, and at the same time, he said that China is a peace-loving nation, etc. So at least from a European perspective, there's a double standard here. But I also want to point out one other fact. I mean, the military parade was to commemorate the 80th year, like the end of the Second World War, which ended in China with the capitulation of the fascist Japanese troops. And on the one hand, I think it's quite important that also the West learns more about the Chinese sacrifices in the Second World War. I think that's largely forgotten, at least in Europe, I would say. But the Chinese really use history as a political weapon. Basically, Xi Jinping drew the line from, okay, we made those sacrifices for humanity, and at the same time, now we want to reach our political goals of the present, and that means conquering Taiwan, or basically taking over Taiwan. I think Xi Jinping in his speech made that connection by, rejuvenating the Chinese nation, and that basically means also we want to rule over Taiwan.
Right, and Andrew, before we delve any deeper into that parade and its participants, of course, let's quickly touch upon the response from US President Donald Trump to the military parade in Beijing. What has he said, and what are your takeaways?
Well, he said a couple of things. One thing, which I guess we'll be discussing subsequently, was his belief that Kim, Putin, and Xi were conspiring against the United States. But he also said, and this references what Fabian was saying just now, that America's role in World War II in the Pacific should have been referenced by Xi, which is a somewhat unusual thing to say, given this was a parade in Beijing by and for China and the Chinese. And as Fabian just mentioned, China's role in World War II is largely forgotten. I mean, the best book I've got on my shelf is by Rana Mitter, the Oxford historian. The book is called, if you can see that, sorry, Forgotten Ally. China suffered around 15 million dead in World War II and fought the Japanese militarists for 10 years. China's World War II started in Manchuria in 1931. America only joined World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. So I rather suspect that while Donald Trump is very familiar with the US role in the Pacific, and certainly it was America which destroyed Japan's Navy and its Air Force and brought the Japanese home islands under aerial bombardment, including, of course, the atomic bombs. It was China which took on the vast bulk of Japan's ground forces for a much longer time than any of the other World War II allies.
Right, and hence the parade on Wednesday in Beijing. Fabian, this particular parade followed a summit under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that began on Sunday, ended on Monday. Now, analysts remain divided over the relevance of the SCO, with some calling it largely symbolic, others pointing to its growing significance, especially in light of Mr. Trump's America First policy. What have you been hearing on the ground?
Well, I think you can make the case that it's symbolic. Well, you have a lot of diverse head of states visiting Tianjin. You have India and at the same time Pakistan, which are hostile to each other. You have basically a diverse group of states which don't have much in common. So you can say, do they share some values? What is actually the common ground of the SCO, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? But still, I would call this meeting definitely significant. Why? I mean, China could pull it off. The guest list was impressive. They could really gather a lot of head of states there. The West was absent, but you had Southeast Asia, you had Central Asia, you had basically half of the world population was present there. And what China is doing, it wants to present itself as an alternative world order. And I think the message can be well received, or can be the better received, the more Donald Trump becomes isolationist, the more he is very disruptive also to his allies with tariffs, trade wars. The more he also, destroys democratic values domestically. So I think the West right now seems to be a little bit in decline. At least that's the message that China wants to portray to the outside world. And right now, I think they have a point.
Right. Andrew, the phrase a multipolar world has been thrown around amid the latest SCO in Tianjin. What does this phrase mean under the current status quo, of course? And is the world headed in that direction, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the world in a very macro, big picture viewpoint, you've got the global south, the developing world, which is widely seen as being sort of up for grabs. That's where the population is. That's where the population growth is. That's where many of the natural resources exist. And of course, that's where the most potential for economic growth exists. So who is going to sort of win the hearts and minds of the global south? On one side, you've got the global north, which is the liberal democracies of the West, and also here in Asia, Japan, South Korea, and further south in Australia. On the other side, you've got this sort of emerging coalition. We can't call it an alliance because it isn't an alliance, and it's dubbed by different names. Some call it the CRINC, which is China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Some people call it the axis of upheaval, i.e. it's, as you say, it wants to change the global world order, global world bodies, arguably global trade and investment patterns away from the Western world, which has been so dominant economically for so long. Some people call it the axis of difficult to say, the axis of authoritarianism, which again is a reference to their governing systems. So in a sense, what does this unofficial grouping of authoritarian powers offer the developing world? It's not the West, which is widely resented, partly for its colonial past, partly for its ongoing dominance. And of course, they can argue that in our system of governance, we have stability because our leadership remains entrenched. We don't have the messiness of democracy and democratic elections and changing parties, changing leaders in power. So this is a war, a struggle, I should say, of ideas, of systems to essentially, this conflict is over who and via what system is the world going to be led in the future. And I rather agree with Fabian. I think there is some dismay in the West. We've, to a large extent, lost our way, and we don't have the confidence in using power that we used to have. Arguably, the leaders of the CRINC are more free, able, and willing to use power, and then, for example, in Vladimir Putin's case, use actual naked military force to achieve national aims.
Right, and speaking about Russia's Vladimir Putin, Fabian, also in China, he dismissed claims that he plans to expand his military operation beyond Ukraine and deeper into Europe. What has been the response to his remarks, especially, of course, keeping in mind the recent Russian GPS hacking that targeted the EU leader's plane, I believe?
Yeah, I think in Europe there's mostly the belief that if Vladimir Putin opens his mouth, I mean, yeah, you cannot really trust his word. I would definitely not rely the national security on Putin's word. He broke his promises many times, especially towards Ukraine. And I mean, you can also make the case that a certain hybrid warfare is already going on. I mean, you have cyber warfare, you have election interference. Andrew is from England, I'm from Germany, both countries on which territory the Russian Secret Service has assassinated people, like critics. At least in my hometown also, there was a murder, like in Berlin, there was one really assassination in broad daylight. So I think Russia, what I think is a likely scenario, that they might use some kind of salami slicing tactic. So basically always use like very small provocations or kind of small provocation. They will not start maybe the big war against a NATO country. But I mean, from a German perspective, yeah, I don't fear an attack by Russia in the near future. But if I would be, let's say, in a Baltic state, in Finland, or even in Poland, I would not be so reassured, because they also have different historic experiences with Russia or the Soviet Union. So yeah, I would say the awareness that the war against Ukraine could escalate into an even broader conflict, and it could also touch other European countries. I think that is a scenario that is getting more likely.
Right. Andrew, back here in South Korea, the North Korean leader's presence at China's parade continues to make quite a lot of headlines. First, what makes Kim Jong-un's attendance at this particular parade over in Beijing so important?
A number of things. I mean, what really struck me with some considerable force was how front and center Kim was during the events in Beijing, on the sort of the review stand, the balcony of the Forbidden City. President Xi was flanked on one side by President Vladimir Putin of Russia, but on the other side by Kim Jong-un of North Korea. So this is really an optical lift in his status. Bear in mind, I think there are 25 leaders from around the world, nations like Pakistan, Iran, Indonesia, Belarus, you know, a lot of other national leaders were present, but Xi clearly chose Kim to be standing beside him. And this suggests the rising import of North Korea in the region, if not in the world, where, you know, the only nation to fight alongside Russia in Ukraine openly has been North Korea. It's deployed its soldiers to fight in Kursk. Right. The other issue, which I think is, you know, very significant, has been widely commented on, is this shows some diplomatic confidence by Kim and his team. All his other prior international engagements have been direct bilaterals, one-on-ones, him with President Xi, with President Trump, with President Moon. This is the first time he's attended a multilateral forum. So this suggests that we may be seeing much more of Kim on the international scene in the years ahead.
Right, and staying with Kim Jong-un, pundits here in South Korea believe that he may have sought to head to China to coordinate with Xi Jinping a potential U.S. policy ahead of a possible meeting with Donald Trump. Again, Fabian, what have you been hearing?
Well, I think this is speculation, but it would make sense. We know that the U.S. president is interested in meeting Kim Jong-un, also still within the year. Whether Kim Jong-un is interested, we don't know yet. But I mean, if he wanted to meet him, then it would make sense that he will get the green light by Beijing and keep Xi Jinping in the loop. But I think there could be also another incentive for Kim to forge ties with China, and that is to balance North Korea's economic dependence that is right now very strong towards Russia. They, have a strong cooperation. North Korea is sending weapons, soldiers, workers, and they get, of course, a lot of money and military technology by Russia. But North Korea is a very risk-averse regime. They don't want to depend on one country alone, and they are very paranoid. Even they distrust the Chinese. They distrust also the Russian. So they really want to balance it, and I think they want to get closer to China, maybe also for economic reasons. And certainly in the northeast of China, the provinces there, they are, for Chinese standards, relatively backwards. They're under pressure to boost their GDP. So I'm sure they would be also happy to get some North Korean workers and or cheap North Korean products and cooperate. So it could be a win-win situation, and I think that would also make sense.
Right. Fabian, there was a brief encounter between South Korean National Assembly Speaker Woo Won-sik, who was in Beijing to represent South Korea. There was a brief encounter between him and North Korea's Kim Jong-un. Could you tell us a bit about what has been shared regarding that particular encounter?
Yeah, we know from the South Korean side that Mr. Woo, he shook hands with Kim Jong-un. That's quite remarkable. I mean, it's very rare that officials from North Korea and South Korea have direct contact. And Mr. Woo made the point that it's important to re-establish dialogue. It's important to make peace on the Korean Peninsula. And he actually also has an interesting family history. I think his ancestors date back to the northern part of the Korean Peninsula, so there's also an emotional aspect to it. Interesting is also what Kim Jong-un responded. Apparently he was nodding and giving a brief yes, and that's it. So can you really call it an exchange? I think the South Korean side made its point, but the reaction by North Korea is very vague, so we don't even know if the North Korean side is open for dialogue at that point.
So what we do know for now is they shook hands in Beijing ahead of the military parade. Andrew, Kim Jong-un was accompanied by his daughter Kim Joo-ae to China. What do you believe is the significance of this reality?
Yeah, this is getting a lot of coffee shop, chat among the commentariat. And this goes back to sort of how do we define North Korea as a state? Is it a communist state? Is it a post-communist state? Is it a highly militarized, corporatist, sort of nationalist state like Japan in World War II? Or is it, as some would have basically, de facto, if not de jure, a monarchy? We've had 3 Kims ruling the country since its foundation in 1948. So there is a belief. I think there's no question really. There's no doubt that after Kim Jong-un passes, one of his children will take over, and the child, who is very much front and center in a lot of public and official visits that Kim Jong-un makes around the country, and now outside the country, is with his daughter, Joo-ae, who's a teen. He's believed to also have a son, but that son, younger than Joo-ae, has not been revealed to the public. So again, a lot of rumor mongering over the state of the Kim family, but certainly it appears to many that Joo-ae may be groomed for the leadership of the nation in the future after her father passes away. And that would be stunning, staggering. Many say that North Korea remains a very, very male-centric society. I remember in Pyongyang in 2006, I was on a bus with other journalists, and we had a North Korean tour guide, and a German colleague of mine said, is it possible that perhaps sometime in the future a female Kim might rule North Korea? And bear in mind, this was before we even knew about Kim Jong-un. This was during the reign of Kim Jong-il, his father. And our tour guide became dramatically agitated and roared, God, if I was not in charge of this tour, I would hurl you off the bus for asking such an outrageous question. Now, that was a long time ago. That was 2 decades prior. But I think there's still a widespread belief that it's a very tough, macho, male-dominated culture. But, Kim Jong-un is a little bit of a change agent. He did, of course, have a Swiss upbringing. And perhaps he is indeed grooming Jue to take over the throne in the future. And if not, it certainly appears that way now. So optically, very interesting development.
Right. Fabian, meanwhile, this week, so it's proving to be a diplomatic super week, if you will, for Beijing. What do you suppose have been some of the gains for China?
Well, you can argue that there's also some gains that can be quantified. Trade deals were done. I mean, for example, China and Russia, they made a deal over a new gas pipeline. But I think the broader gains are diplomatic in nature. The messaging that China sends out to the world, the news headlines that they dominated this week. And, China is now very confident, very assertive. The masks are off. So, I mean, just a couple of years ago, I think many Europeans wouldn't believe how openly China would present itself next to Russia and Kim and basically tell the West, look, we don't follow your rules. We see that the East is rising under, the leadership of China, and the West is in decline. That's Xi Jinping's message. And I think that is a message that in the global South is relatively well received. And right now, the dynamic is pretty strong for Xi Jinping. And let me remind you, just a couple of weeks ago, there were many media who speculated about Xi Jinping's position because he, had kept a low profile in public. And I mean, I didn't place much value in that back then, but now it's clear, no, Xi Jinping, he's firm in power and he's very looking confident into the future.
Right. Well, he did say that China was now unstoppable, I believe, during his speech at the start of that parade. Andrew, what have been the gains for Russia and North Korea this week? I mean, you did say the optics, especially for North Korea, have been quite great.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we don't know what was discussed behind closed doors. I just saw that Kim and Putin had a 2.5-hour closed-door summit. We can only speculate on what was discussed there, but it seems very, very clear that this, what many people describe as a purely transactional relationship, I think is here to stay. We're going to continue to see a strong relationship between North Korea and Russia for the foreseeable future, because I simply do not see any end in sight to the war in Ukraine. Some may argue that Vladimir Putin will drop Kim, because even by Russian standards, North Korea is pretty toxic. After the war in Ukraine comes to an end. I'm not so sure that is the case. I think these two states are building real firm ties based around their military relationship, interest in pushing back against Western pressure, and their role as two very, very heavily sanctioned states. For North Korea, though, again, my big surprise was how front and center Xi was willing to make him arguably his second most honored guest among this vast meeting of leaders from around the world, and most particularly from the global South. So this puts Kim in an almost perfect position. He's now in a situation where he has two strong allies, and they are allies. He has mutual defense treaties with both China and Russia now, and that means he doubles up, but it also means he can play one off against the other. They both seem to be seeking his amity and arguably trade, investment, commerce down the line in the future. North Korea is not a rich country, but it could get a lot richer with support from these two economic powers. So I think for Kim, it's been a triumph, and one has to wonder whether it had been made clear in the diplomatic exchanges leading up to Kim's appearance in Beijing, whether Xi guaranteed him such a high profile. That, of course, is something we don't know and possibly will never know. But yeah, for Putin, business as usual. For Kim, pretty extraordinary.
Right. And on that note, I suppose we'll have to end today. Andrew, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you,
Fabian, here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights. Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. We return same time tomorrow with a panel session on social headlines. Do join us then. As always, thank you for now.